Hello and welcome to Crystal Bridges. I'm Rachel Johnson and I'm a member of the Public Programs team here. To begin our program, I'd like to start with our Indigenous Peoples Acknowledgement, recognizing the museum's role as settlers and guests in the Northwest Arkansas region. We acknowledge the Caddo, Quapaw, and Osage, as well as the many Indigenous caretakers of this land and water. We appreciate the enduring influence of the vibrant, diverse, and contemporary cultures of Indigenous peoples. We are conscious of the role in colonization that museums have played. As cultural institutions, we have a responsibility to engage in dismantling the historic and systemic invisibility of Indigenous peoples past, present, and future. We choose to intentionally hold ourselves accountable to appropriate conversation, representation, connection, and education to facilitate a space of measurable change. This year, we have had a rare opportunity to show the first edition of the Constitution in our exhibit, We the People, The Radical Notion of Democracy. This is on view until January 2nd, 2023. This document is displayed in conversation with works of art by influential historic and contemporary artists that provide diverse American perspectives on the nation's founding principles. This opportunity has also allowed us to present an incredible variety of programs that centered on the relevancy of these foundational documents for all. And on the occasion of Veterans Day, I am honored to present this conversation that spotlights defending our Constitution. Here at Crystal Bridges, we are proud to have an active veterans resource group for our veterans on staff. This group fosters a supportive culture for staff members who have served or have family members who have served in the military. I'm also pleased to share with you that today, 11/11/22, is Crystal Bridges' 11th anniversary. For 11 years, we have been welcoming all to celebrate the American spirit in a setting that unites the power of art with the beauty of nature. Here's to many more. This program was made possible through the generous support of our sponsors and friends of Crystal Bridges. I'd like to extend our gratitude. Please join me in thanking our exhibition and program sponsors. Thank you to Arkansas PBS for their partnership in making this evening's program accessible to those tuning in from home and remotely via live stream. We're grateful to have your support on this and other efforts supporting the exhibition and our mission. Throughout the talk, if you have a question, we will be gathering them using the QR code you see on the screen. If you open your camera and hold your phone camera, that is, and hold it up to the screen, it should direct you to a link where you can submit your question. At the end of the talk, we'll be taking a few questions from the audience. And with that, I would like to welcome Cash Logan. He serves not only as our Director of Protection Services, but also served in the military and is a father of active service members, to say a few words.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. Yes, my name is Cash Logan, and I'm the Director of Protection Services here at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. Thank you for joining us this evening to recognize our veterans and We the People, the radical notion of democracy. As a former member of the military, a father of a daughter who is in college on an ROTC scholarship, and a son who's an active duty member of the Army Ranger Battalion, I obviously have deep feelings for the military service. Military service is a sacrifice that few understand. It means that those who serve or have served have at some point placed the country's needs ahead of their own. They agreed to serve to ensure that all of us, past and future, continue to enjoy the freedoms that are guaranteed by our Constitution. I can't think of any sacrifice more meaningful than the one shared by all of us that have made this sacrifice for our country. Today, we celebrate and honor America's veterans for their patriotism and willingness to serve and sacrifice for the common good. Will you join me in thanking the veterans that are among us today? Will the veterans please stand? thank you all. Crystal Bridges, over the last few months, has hosted monthly ceremonies for new service members swearing their oath of enlistment to the Constitution. While every service member takes this oath, what made these ceremonies so special was the intimate setting in the presence of the Constitution itself. It reminds us how personal and powerful it is to devote yourself to service of country. Crystal Bridges would like to extend a sincere thank you to Brent Parmeter, the head of Walmart Military and Veterans Affairs, for bringing the oath of enlistment ceremonies to life here at Crystal Bridges. Again, a hand for Brent. And now I'm pleased to introduce our special guests. Rick Waddle is a semi-retired businessman, former government official, and retired Army reservist. Rick served 12 years on active duty in the Army as a combat engineer, go Sappers, culminating as director for Europe on the NSC in the Clinton administration. In his reserve career, Rick deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan part of every year from 2004 to 2013. He served as deputy commander for Reserve Affairs at U.S. Southern Command, commanded the 76th Division Operational Response, and served as assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and senior military advisor to the Secretary of State. Rick is the first Army reservist promoted to Lieutenant General in a normally active duty billet since Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, who served in World War II. Next, Commander Susan Kilrain is a renowned astronaut, a distinguished Navy test pilot, and aerospace engineer, and a world traveler. She's the youngest person and one of only 3 women to pilot the space shuttle. She served 20 years in the Navy, paving the way for the path for women along that journey. She has flown more than 3,000 flight hours in over 30 different aircraft, and she was awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal. Commander Kilrain flew as a pilot of STS-83 and STS-94, spending more than 20 days in space. When not training for spaceflight, she worked in mission control during launches and landings for other space shuttle missions. She has also worked at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., in the offices of Safety and Legislative Affairs. Now, to begin our program, we're honored to share with you a special message from General Wesley Clark, who was originally hoping to join us for the discussion in person, but he's otherwise engaged presenting at a little thing called the G20 Summit in Indonesia. General Clark retired as a 4-star general after 38 years in the United States Army, and his awards include the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and especially thank you, Olivia, Walton, and the Walton families. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but I really do appreciate the opportunity to reflect on Veterans Day and the Constitution. We're going to honor our nation's veterans, but who are they? And why did they don the uniform? What did they achieve? Simply put, they were ordinary Americans from every state and walk of life, mobilized in wartime, some drafted in peacetime during the Cold War, and today they're all volunteers. They felt the call of duty to their homes, their families, to their communities, and to the country. They took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It was a total commitment. Their time, their labor, their intellect, their very lives at risk to protect us, our Constitution. During World War I, we mobilized 4 million men, including my father. Men from Arkansas like Clark, Etzbach, Dodson, all relatives, served. During World War II, we mobilized 16 million. Among them were Donahoe, Moon, Lovelace, Gunn, an uncle, and the fathers of neighbors who were in uniform. I grew up in their shadow. I saw the pictures. I handled the pistols they brought back as souvenirs. I heard the stories. And above all, I sensed their commitment, their willingness to sacrifice, their fellowship and service to the country. I grew up not being able to imagine a higher calling. I took the oath at Trophy Point at West Point in 1962. John Kennedy was our president. He'd famously said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." But we understood the oath wasn't to him. It was to the Constitution of the United States. I went on to serve 34 years as an officer in the United States Army. In Vietnam, I was a company commander. We fought in a poorly conceived effort to block the spread of communism, a war waged by North Vietnamese, but thoroughly supported by the Soviet Union and Communist China. We fought it in the direction of the president as our commander-in-chief, first Lyndon B. Johnson, then Richard Nixon. But when Congress cut out the funding, following its constitutional authority, it was over. When South Vietnam fell, we in uniform wept for our losses, but we respected the process, Congress, and their responsibility for funding. I worked briefly in the White House in the 1970s under the leadership of President Gerald R. Ford. I was among the holdovers from Watergate, and they were a bruised and wary lot. Congress was investigating the CIA and NSA. I was the stuckee managing the documents in the White House, and it was a difficult time as Congress pried apart the secret actions and processes. But they did it to safeguard Americans. It was a commitment by the people of the United States to hold the executive branch accountable and change the law if necessary, and it was done. In the early 1980s, after my battalion command, I served an assignment in the Office of the Chief of Staff of the Army. It was during a time when there was a real effort by the communists to take over Central America. We saw the threat, but Congress said, stop funding. And so in the middle of this, there was an illegal effort by some in the White House to take funds that were gained from weapons sales to Iran and give them to the people in Central America. It was stopped after an investigation. Some heads rolled on that. The Constitution was preserved. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States acted to promote stability in Eastern Europe amidst the conflict that attended the breakup of Yugoslavia. As a lieutenant general, I helped with the diplomacy and military planning and testified several times before Congress on U.S. strategy. Later, as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, I led NATO military action to halt Serb ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. The action was authorized by the President under the War Powers Act, established in the wake of the Vietnam War at the demands of Congress, and it succeeded. After a 78-day campaign of bombing and planning for a ground invasion, and with the support of the United States Congress. Today, the region's at peace. Kosovo is an independent nation, and Kosovo is America's greatest friend in the region. So I've lived with the separation of powers, the checks and balances, the value of different perspectives and interests that were written into the Constitution by our founding fathers. All of us veterans have, and we wouldn't have it any other way. We put our lives in trust not to a single person, but to a set of principles enshrined by law, secure in our belief that there is something a bit magical about the common sense and wisdom that emerges from the competition and compromise that our Constitution demands. When the nation makes a mistake, and inevitably we do, we have the means to correct it. And this is the real magic of America and our Constitution. That's what we've all defended. The challenges continue. A new generation's got to pick up the responsibilities of service. Veterans Day. Thanks for honoring us veterans, but this is not just about the past, it's about the future. We call on the next generation, pick up the burden, serve, protect our Constitution. Thank you.
And without further ado, would you help me welcome tonight's speakers to the podium?
Susan and I coordinated this. I'll start and she'll finish. Look, I can't believe that I have the privilege to be here on this stage. It's what my Hollywood daughter calls the imposter syndrome. Because no way do I belong up here when I look at General Clark's accomplishments or Susan's list of accomplishments, literally out of this world kind of stuff, right? Or the people that created and run this institution. I do want to thank the Walton family for having me here. But I'm going to try and make do despite being an imposter, right? For some background, the staff asked me if I'd ever been to Northwest Arkansas today. You hear a lot of my classmates laughing out there because I was born a mile from here on Main Street, and I went to and graduated from Bentonville Schools, also about a mile or so from here. And I grew up under the north end of the XNA Airport back in simpler times. And that'll be important later, as is the fact that I'm not trained in the law. But how wonderful it is to be in this place where we have so much of our valuable American art on display as we gather to marvel at perhaps our most important national treasure, the U.S. Constitution. I saw a copy of the original Federalist Papers in there. Normally, at the National Archives, you get the Constitution, you get the Declaration of Independence, and you get the Bill of Rights all together. These are indeed, our most important national treasures. But they're words expressing revolutionary ideas that have transfigured the world, really. The treasured words are what unify the 56 separate jurisdictions of the United States, from the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean to Alaska to the Northern Marianas in the Western Pacific. We often forget just how different we can be based on where we live and how we were raised, but these words and their meanings provide most of the glue that hold us together. And we ought to be amazed at their simplicity. The Declaration is only one page. The Constitution, as it was originally written in hand, has 4 pages. The Bill of Rights is another single page, and those pages include the signatures. 6 simple pages with simple words but profound ideas. And as we look at these documents, each plays a different role. The Declaration was a statement of grievances against the King of England, but it also lays out the revolutionary ideas for that time, and indeed for now, that basic rights belong to each of us at birth, and that governments should be created to secure these rights, not to provide the rights, but to secure them, but only with the consent of the people governed. And moreover, those same people have the right to alter or abolish a government and create a new one. But why was it so revolutionary? Because at the time, most human beings were subjects of some sort of king, queen, or emperor, not citizens, which means that they were subject in most respects to the whims of a sovereign individual, hence the use of the word subject. But once that revolution was over in America, what comes next? James Madison, one of the main influencers of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and co-author of the Federalist Papers, explained his motives. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. However, the farmers, the planters, and the merchants who wrote these documents were well versed in the classics, so they knew the contrast between the processes of Athenian direct democracy, the structure of the Roman Republic, the oligarchies of the medieval Italian city-states, including the 500-year-old Venetian Republic, which was still in existence in the 1780s, as well as the reigning forms of European monarchical empires, some of which were more absolutist than others. And of course, they had the example of the mother of all parliaments in England, the Magna Carta, as well as the self-government that all 13 colonies had at the time of the Declaration. So the founders picked and chose among these traditions to compose our own form of democratic representative republic. But what does the Constitution, building upon the Declaration, actually do for us? It tells us how we manage our disagreements via the electoral processes and our legislature, which comes first in Article 1. It then sets forth how we manage the few enumerated powers of the central government, which is via the executive branch in Article 2. But since disagreements and management sometimes are not satisfactory, The Constitution also gives us a means to settle disputes via our legal and judicial processes, which are found in Article 3. And the document also provides, as General Clark mentioned, for change over time. Article 4 provides for the admission of new states, and Article 5 establishes the procedures for changes to the Constitution itself. Imagine this all on 4 pages. But there was a warning that is found in the existence of that third document that often travels with these, which is the Bill of Rights. And it was simply that centralized power, even if constrained at its creation, can be so dangerous that it needs specific limits. So the Bill of Rights is the compromise between those who sought a relatively stronger form of centralized government and those who feared what a centralized government might grow to do. But let's return just for a moment to the main idea that runs through the 3 documents. It's simply that you, as an individual, matter. You are citizens born with inherent rights and not merely a subject who must suffer the capricious whims of some distant king or monarch. Indeed, the main idea is that you get to spend your life using your personal liberty to pursue your happiness within modest constraints. And through the democratic processes, you actually get to have a say in what those constraints are. Hence the theme of the current exhibition, We the People, the Radical Notion of Democracy. It was pretty radical, in fact. The late Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, he once wrote, and I quote, "The government is itself an art, one of the subtlest of arts. It is neither business, nor technology, nor applied science. It is the art of making men live together in peace and with reasonable happiness." So what is important in this art is how do we keep those who lose disputes and disagreements on side, still engaged, still part of the process, awaiting for their next chance. These documents, with their central idea, I'll turn my page here in a second. There we go. Central idea of the importance of you as an individual, and their processes have shown themselves to be remarkably resilient in the face of rebellions, domestic disputes, and even a civil war. But despite this resilience, Americans since the very founding have been worried about how to keep our system of government going, which brings us to the other theme for tonight, which is defending our Constitution. At the very beginning, though, even the founders worried whether we could master this task, or as Frankfurter put it, this art. One of the frequently told stories is that a woman approached Benjamin Franklin as he was leaving the Constitutional Convention and asked him what was achieved. And Franklin replied, "A republic if you can keep it." As the founders themselves split into different electoral factions in the ensuing elections, a common criticism that they hurled at each other was the pretension to monarchy and aristocracy. Washington was accused of wanting to be a king, and John Adams was derided as the Duke of Braintree. Braintree was his small farm outside Boston. Now, our concern for defending the Constitution, therefore, is not a new one, but it's enduring and widespread. Indeed, leaping ahead 50 years from the Constitutional Convention, one can find a theme for speeches in 1837 was the perpetuation of our political institutions, just 50 years later. In January of 1837, in fact, a 28-year-old Abraham Lincoln rose to address the Young Men's Lyceum in the tiny town of Springfield, Illinois, from where the frontier was literally just a short walk away. One can imagine the rough characters attending that speech, and that it was cold, with the meeting hall probably heated by a fireplace. Lighting came from candles and maybe a whale oil lamp or two, but it would have been nonetheless dim. Lincoln was largely self-taught in all subjects and had begun practicing law just the year before. But Lincoln's profound thought that night about that topic was simply that America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter, he said, and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. He finished his thought by saying, quote, "As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide." Of particular concern to Lincoln, prompting his speech, had been the outbreak of mob violence in several states over different issues. So Lincoln appealed to all Americans, 28-year-old Lincoln, right, to have a reverence for the rule of law, that reverence should be taught from the cradle onwards, even as Americans worked to change laws that they considered unjust. As Lincoln aptly put it, quote, "There is no grievance that is a fit object of redress by mob law." So writing in those same years, to give you another view, Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a visitor from France, observed about American democracy, quote, "Nothing is more wonderful than the art of being free, but nothing is harder to learn than how to use that freedom." There's that word art again, and we are, after all, gathered in a great art museum. Seems fitting. De Tocqueville went on to say about American democracy, quote, "Without common ideas, there is no common action. And without common action, men still exist, but a social body does not. Thus, in order that there be society, and all the more that this society prosper, it is necessary that all the minds of the citizens always be brought together and held together by some principal ideas." Now, I promised that I'd get back to my upbringing and my lack of legal training. I think what's most important in life, I learned within 10 miles of this very spot. I was raised among the last of the freest men in Earth's history, and that's the American small farmer. They were simple people that joined up in their millions to serve the world wars, that migrated to the big cities to staff the factories. And like Lincoln's young men on the frontier, they were quite cognizant of all their basic rights as citizens and their responsibilities. Those common ideas that de Tocqueville referenced, those basic principles. And like so many people in my family before me, as General Clark also referenced in his case, I took the oath to support and defend the Constitution. And I remarked earlier today at the Rotary event that the basic oath of enlistment was written by our founders in 1789 when the Constitution went into effect, and continued unchanged until 1960 when it was only modified slightly. That means that the people who wrote the Constitution would recognize today's oath, and I offer that as an astounding connection across every generation of Americans so far. And that oath binds us to those simple words and profound ideas on display in this museum. So in conclusion, before I turn it over to Susan, I'll say again, our most important national treasures put you as individuals in the center of our politics and our system of government. As Lincoln told us, the first and main line of defense of our democratic institution lies within you. Writing about 107 years after Lincoln, the American jurist Learned Hand, it's quite a name, warned us that liberty must lie in the hearts of men and women, because without that, no court of law could do much to help us. Therefore, I would argue that you do not need to be trained in law to understand what those 6 pages mean to you and to the fragile fabric of our civilization. Just as war is too important to be left to generals and admirals alone, so these words and the laws and processes derived therefrom are far too important to be left to politicians, lawyers, and judges. To give them full force and effect, to give this treasure its value, you have to live them. As de Tocqueville might have put it, learn how to use your freedom. The words in these 3 documents bind us across the generations, but it's you that gives value to the treasure. So the best defense of our Constitution is for you to live it. Thank you.
Hello. Well, I may have traveled farther and higher than Rick, but he definitely runs circles around me in the Speaking with Elegance department. While Rick grew up near here and knows almost the entire audience, I grew up all the way over in Georgia, but I'm pretty sure y'all are going to understand me anyway. What a rare treat we have here at the Crystal Bridges Museum, we are fortunate to lay eyes on the most precious documents of our great country. While the Declaration of Independence is most remembered for declaring our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Constitution is a little bit more complicated. 235 years ago, 55 men spent several months laying out the foundation for the laws of our young nation. There were many compromises during those months, along with some very heated arguments. In the end, our Constitution was founded and signed by 39 of the delegates. Some had already left, 3 refused to sign. After many more months, the 9 required states ratified the Constitution, and it became the highest law in the land. We, the people, says it all. Every single person has a voice. Of course, it was a room full of white men who wrote the document, and we all know not everyone was originally given a voice. However, the most amazing thing is that these men expected our country to grow and change over time and included a process on how to amend the document. Most immediately, the Bill of Rights was ratified. James Madison proposed 20 amendments. 17 were approved by the House, 12 were approved by the Senate, and 10 were ratified by the states. Most notably, the Bill of Rights protects our right to free speech, to bear arms, and to a fair judicial system. The hardest to understand is the 9th Amendment, which basically says that even though a right isn't listed in the Bill of Rights, the Constitution protects those rights too. The most recent amendment to the Constitution was also one of the original. One of the 2 that didn't get ratified, was finally ratified in 1997. Interestingly, that's an amendment that addresses pay raises to legislators. Reading through the Constitution and the amendments, I can see that very little was missed. However, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that nowhere in the Constitution is a woman's right to equality protected. My husband said, "Really? Are you sure?" Yeah, the 19th Amendment gave us the right to vote, but an equal rights amendment has never been ratified. So, over half the people in our country are not equally represented by our Constitution. Calvin Coolidge once stated, "To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that has ever been accorded the human race." In fact, the Constitution is the world's longest surviving written charter of a government. However, it was not penned without huge challenges and arguments. The first power struggle was between small states and large states. The compromise was to form 2 houses, as we all know, the Senate, which has equal representation for every state, and the House of Representatives, which the numbers of representatives are determined by the size of the population of the state. State versus federal power was the second area of contention and has been an issue throughout our country's history. Concern that federal rule would oppress the citizens made it imperative that the Constitution limit the power of the federal government, giving the states the rest of the control. Executive power was a huge area of concern after the Revolutionary War. Americans were suspicious of executive power after fighting tyranny. After voting 60 times, the delegates finally formed the Electoral College, which is kind of contentious a lot of times around election. our elections just recently, and we'll hear about it again at the next elections. But I think most who really study the reasoning behind the Electoral College will discover how brilliant it really was. When I first studied the Constitution, I was surprised to learn that before it was ratified, each state issued its own currency, and there was no national commerce system. George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton convinced the rest of the delegates that one currency, one nation would make this country an economic powerhouse, and they weren't wrong. The most debated issue between the delegates was slavery. The word slave doesn't even appear in the original document, as many felt the very word would sully the Constitution. After lengthy arguments, the final compromise and the only mention of the fact that there was slavery counted as 3/5 of a person. A slave counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of determining the number of representatives in each state. This gave southern states a greater voting power. Had that not happened, it would have been a whole different history we'd be talking about. Certain presidents would not have been elected. Neither slaves nor women had any rights under the Constitution as it was ratified. Thankfully, the 13th Amendment ended slavery, the 14th gave equal protection to all men, and the 15th gave all men the right to vote. And finally, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. Many have recently asked, does the Constitution still work? Voters younger than 50 are twice as likely as older Americans to say it's no longer relevant. Yes, flaw men wrote it, and it's not perfect, but it was written in a way that ultimately allowed us, as a nation, to eliminate slavery, protect our right to demonstrate for our rights, and gave women the right to vote. Churchill quoted an anonymous source when he said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried." And I tend to agree. While our country and our Constitution are not perfect, this is still the greatest country in the world to live. Today is Veterans Day, originally Armistice Day, founded for the end of World War I, the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month. The day commemorates all veterans. There are currently 16 million veterans in our country, and over half are greater than 65 years old. There are still 160,000 living World War II vets. Pretty much all of them are over 90 now. I chose to join the Navy in 1985 to become a pilot. Some of my best memories are flying A6s, becoming a test pilot, and then learning to fly the F-14 Tomcat. I went on to have the privilege to pilot 2 space shuttle missions and ultimately retired from the Navy after 20 years. I've also served 25 years as a Navy spouse. My husband is at 39 years as a Navy SEAL, and as you can imagine, he was gone way more than he was ever home. And most of those years, I was also the mother of 4 kids, which, by the way, is way harder than flying the space shuttle. Veterans Day is a day to thank military veterans and their families. And I'm not talking about me, because I've had it pretty easy as a space shuttle pilot and the wife of a high-ranking naval officer. But Cash recognized the veterans in the room, and I would like to take this time to recognize other people. If you are a spouse of a veteran, please stand. If you are a child of a veteran, please stand. And I don't care how old you are. If you are a parent of a veteran, please stand. And now, if you are a veteran, please stand. And I'd like to mostly recognize the younger enlisted and their family, and those who have fought our wars, who deserve our true thanks. I never went to war. There is little income that these young enlisted families get. They put their lives in danger. Their spouses don't know if their spouse is coming home. The kids are moved from school to school every time the military decides they need a new set of orders. I mean, they move schools more often than you change tires on your car. Military life is tough, and Veterans Day is for them. From 2016 to 2019, my family and I lived in Mons, Belgium. Even now, 100 years after the Great War, every town in Belgium has a ceremony at the nearest World War I cemetery. Every single year, the citizens thank any American who shows up to pay respect. Several generations have passed, yet I was very humbled to see how the new generation still thanks Americans for fighting for their freedom over 100 years ago. Now we live in Washington, D.C., which is the crossroad of free speech. Hardly a weekend goes by without a huge demonstration on the Mall. That's our Constitution at work. I have been so fortunate to see our constitutionally protected rights work in our nation's capital and to learn firsthand how other countries' governments work, and sometimes don't work. In the past 40 years, as a member of the military and as a spouse, I can honestly say our Constitution is certainly relevant today. And in summary, I quote, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States." Thank you. You want me to kick it off? All right. So before we get to your questions, which I hope there are some, Rick and I thought we would ask each other some questions, and that might encourage you to have more questions. So, Rick, you served on the National Security Council in the White House, and I'm wondering, did you have an opportunity to firsthand see our Constitution at work?
Yes, I did. I served actually on the National Security Council in two presidencies. One was President Clinton and under President Trump. And so the rules that we observe descend or derive from the Constitution. So, the National Security Council's job is to advise the president on matters of foreign and defense policy. And so the way our laws engage on everything from can you deploy an aircraft carrier to things that are much more brutal than that are passed through the lens of our constitutional and legal system. But it is interesting because, and General Clark mentioned this in his remarks about the interaction of the executive, which is an Article II power, and the Congress, which is an Article I power. And let me tell you, both of those institutions are very jealous of their powers, very jealous. And so normally the dispute is around, Mr. President, Article I allows you to do this, but Article II means that the Congress will fund you or not, right? So you want the aircraft carrier to sail, it better be in the budget. So yes, I got to see it in both of those administrations, close hand every day, every day. Matter of fact, I don't know how many lawyers were there, but there were a lot. Okay, my turn. In your case, you've raised your children in the military, clearly, 25 years with them, and you've got one daughter that's about to become a Navy pilot, and you've got a son that wants to go to the Naval Academy. I mean, do you sense in that generation the same commitment that so many of us have felt in our lives. You know, a lot of us are over 50, so, you know, there's the ones under 50 is what I'm concerned about.
You know, our children, yes, the commitment, but the generation as a whole, you can tell the militaries are all well behind in their recruitment numbers now. I mean, significantly behind. And that shows that this generation isn't as dedicated and doesn't want to go into the military like our generation did. And, you know, I would have thought our kids would have run so far from the military as they could, because literally my two youngest have been to 10 different schools, and one is only in 10th grade. So that's more often than you change tires. Almost as often as you change your oil in your car, they've changed schools. So, but yeah, the oldest has a slot to fly for the Navy. Never understand where she got that idea from. And then our second wants to be a Navy SEAL when he gets out of college, and my third wants to go to the Naval Academy. So I think we're raising a group of military officers.
Well, that's good. Now, I've got a question, and it pertains to this. It says, how can we encourage young citizens to get involved in democracy, which is broader than just military service, right? What do you think about that?
You know, I think civics is taught here. I think it's a requirement here to graduate in Arkansas. But some states have done away with the requirement to take civics class, and I think it needs to come back. And more encouragement into boys' state and girls' state, where they actually get to live it and see it in action, and they go to Washington, D.C. I mean, being exposed to it is important. And the military is having a good bit of trouble, not just because some people don't want to be in the military, but people that want to be in the military cannot get into the military because things that they've done as children and as teenagers comes back to haunt them later. And the militaries are having to sort of regroup and think, okay, how long are we going to hold them accountable for some of the things they might have done as a child or as a teenager? And so the militaries are going to have to come to grip with that. Otherwise, nobody's going to be able to get in at some point.
I think General Clark mentioned we took in 16 million people in World War II. I don't think they were particularly picky what they were doing about as teenagers. But, you know, we may have to go back to that. Here's a question. What is an accomplishment you are proud of your many?
My accomplishment, I haven't completely accomplished yet, but so far I have gotten 2 children to 18 successfully. Got 2 more to go. And so, you know, people would say flying in space, becoming an astronaut or whatever, but for me, being a mother trumps all of those accomplishments.
It asks what is an accomplishment. I'll just give you one of, I mean, there's a lot of things I'm proud of, but going to and graduating from Bentonville High School in 1978 with a lot of you people is something I'm really happy about. Let's see, here's another one. Let's see, having served in the military and knowing how fragile democracies are, how do you process what's happening in Ukraine, and how do you talk about it with young people in your lives? You want to go first? I'll go second.
Sure. We talk about current events often in our family, and Ukraine is a prime example of that. It's very hard to explain what's going on in Ukraine right now. Our kids obviously are too young to have really experienced it. I mean, Afghanistan was the closest they came, but out and out invasion of another country and the bombings that are affecting civilians, killing civilians, and the torture and whatnot, it's almost impossible to understand. And then it's very difficult to explain why we're not doing more. But once we talk to them about, one, we want to protect that boundary between Russia and NATO, and perhaps even bring Ukraine into NATO, we also have to talk about, we can't, if we went in, then we will have declared war ourselves, and they get that. They understand.
Yeah, it's, you know, I tell people, and I was, of course, just retired late last year, And many of us in the profession of the military as well as the intelligence community, we simply got it wrong. We thought that the Russians were a lot stronger than they have turned out to be, and we thought the Ukrainians would be a lot weaker. And it was a policy, right or wrong, in hindsight it looks wrong, but a policy through 2 different administrations and several administrations in the NATO countries not to arm Ukraine before the war. And you might say, why? Well, because frankly, we were afraid the Ukrainians would use them on the Russians and try and reclaim the territory, thus exacerbating a war. Well, you get the war anyway. And so this is an opportunity to talk to the young people about some of the harsh realities of the world. We haven't seen a war like this in Europe since 1945. Now that's a long peace. That's the good news. The bad news is war hasn't just evaporated and gone away. We're still human beings. War is still a violent contest of wills between political entities, in this case, Russia and Ukraine. Now, a little historical tidbit, Russia acquired Ukraine in 1783, which is the same year the peace treaty of Paris was signed that ended the American Revolution. So the animosities run deep over their historical animosities. Okay, another question. They keep sending them to me. They're letting me run this. They thought the shuttle pilot, so they gave it to me, right? Right. Let's see. What gives you faith and hope for the future? A great question, given the theme tonight.
When I think that every generation thinks, oh my gosh, this country is going down the tubes. The younger generation, listen to their music, look at the clothes they wear. And I know my parents said it about my generation, and we say it about the next generation. I have faith that we're going to be okay. I definitely don't believe it's all going to be smooth sailing. We got rough days ahead, just like we had rough days behind. But I look at my kids and I look at my kids' friends and I see how engaged they are and how intelligent they are and how they have the same dreams that we had as kids. I have hope already, and I trust that we'll just keep going along, and despite the ups and downs, we're going to come out okay.
I guess what gives me faith and hope for the future is I take comfort in the history of the nation, right? I mean, it's a strange time in the world. Threats loom on the horizon, but if you think about where we have come from over time, and of course, most of the history I know I learned here, and however bad you think it is today, if you remember talking to your parents or your grandparents about how bad it was in the Depression, for example, or how bad it was out on the frontiers, or if you look at the historical animosities that we faced over time, then we came through all that because of the structure and the resiliency of those documents that Susan and I were talking about. Just to give you a little tidbit, the election of 1800 was not decided by the voters. It was decided in the House of Representatives under Article 1 of the Constitution because they had no clear winner. And the guy who lost that election back in those days before the 12th Amendment was the guy who was appointed vice president. So for those of you who've seen the play Hamilton, you know that's Aaron Burr. The animosities were so deep that Aaron Burr eventually challenges the man that made sure he wasn't president, Alexander Hamilton, to a duel and killed him, sitting vice president. 1824, we had another hung election decided in Congress. 1876 had another hung election. And this one was, they creatively packaged a deal negotiating outside of Congress, then took it to Congress for ratification. And those of you old enough remember we had some issue with the 2000 election as well. We've come through it all. So I do think that you should take faith and hope from the fact that we've been through these things and our system of government provides the capability of resolving them. Okay, let's see. On to the next question. Here's one for you, Susan. What advice would you give someone who wants to be an astronaut? I wanna know
Jeremy,
this
did
too.
that come from y'all? Oh, okay. um, it depends, on your age, but the three things still hold true no matter how old you are. First, of course, it's your academics. You have to do well in school, especially in a STEM field. You're going to need a degree, and now pretty much an advanced degree in a STEM field, at least through a master's level. The second is staying physically fit and in good medical shape, because it's hard on your bodies to fly in space. And then the most important, I think, is the ability to work in a team, because nobody goes to space by themselves anymore. It's always in a team. And you don't want to underestimate how hard that can be sometimes. You might be assigned in a team with someone that you don't particularly care for, but it's important to become a team and be professional. And so all the kids that I talk to, when they get assigned group projects at school and they can't stand group projects, I just tell them they're training to be astronauts someday, because that's what it is. It's being a team. And that's really the three things. Now, if you're already in college, you're already doing STEM fields, and I have other advice, feel free to reach out to me, SusanKilrain.com. I'm happy to help mentor anyone that wants to go into the Navy or go in and be a NASA astronaut someday.
Oh, here's a good one. Having two members of the military speaking in a program in an art museum is pretty unexpected. What role does art play in your lives?
That is a great question. And now they've changed STEM to STEAM to include the arts. But I will say, if you're getting an education to become an astronaut, you still got to stick with STEM. Right now, maybe someday when we're building habitats and we need more people, we're going to need artists there for mental health reasons. But, an appreciation of art, I think, is so important. And just the perspective that an astronaut gets gazing down at the Earth from space, there is nothing more artistically beautiful than our planet. And it changes every second because you're flying so fast, and it changes, and it's daylight for 45 minutes and nighttime for 45 minutes. I never got tired of looking out the window. I flew back when there weren't digital cameras, so I took probably 400 rolls of film on my 16 days, the one mission that was 16 days. And so an appreciation of art and beauty is a good thing for an astronaut to have, because everything we did in space on my mission was dedicated to making life here on Earth better. And when someone asks, why should we even bother spending money going into space, the return we got on the dollar well exceeded the amount that was spent to get us there. And our planet has only benefited from the science that we conducted in space. And lately, there was a SpaceX, the first crew that went up in the SpaceX, they actually did art in space. They painted and whatnot in space, and then came back and auctioned it off, all to benefit Jude's Children's Hospital. And so they were definitely tying art into space flight.
I can't top that. So actually, let's see, it's 7. Thank you both. Okay, I'm about to get the hook, I think, up here. I'll just say that in my perspective, my stick figures don't even look like stick figures when I'm done drawing them, although my grandson and I do some pretty awesome Play-Doh sculptures.
What about musical talent? You got some musical talent?
Not that either, no. None of that. So what do I get out of art? I get out, it's just amazing to me to walk through an art gallery. And I include music in art, obviously, and music's the window to the soul. So it, at least for me, it uplifts me, right, when I do that. And I'm always amazed at how people can get the colors to fit and how it actually looks like something when they're done. So, okay, so it says, thank you both. I think we're done.
Thank you.